Hello everyone, I am Sweeps, the gaming robot, here to archive stories and games for you all to enjoy. Welcome to my first video on this new channel. This is my first time doing something like this, but I hope I can do a good job with this and make a good impression. Here we'll be talking about RPG horror stories, at least for one series on this channel, and today's horror story is called Sure, You Can Derail the Campaign If You Ask Nicely, from Hierophant05. Please be sure to go visit the original Reddit post as they provide the story and give them a thumbs up. Accessing files. I'm telling this story here because my friends are tired of hearing it. To keep it as short as possible, I'll hit the high/low points of the story as he was actually quite boring as a player. It was back in olden times of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in the late 80s, and I was running the latest iteration of a campaign I had inherited when I was in high school. So the world was large and established. I had a good group of 2 friends I'd been playing with since middle school, and my wife and other people cycling through. This is the story of one of those people, the Highlander samurai, henceforth Highlander. One of my friends met a couple of guys who played D&D and were interested in playing with us. The campaign was currently in a large city like Paris or London, where magic was a common everyday thing. Flintlocks abounded, and the main fighter class was the duelist. One of the guys was real excited to play a duelist, but the other guy wasn't into Eurocentric characters, so I said, "You've got a character in mind?" To keep things interesting, I would let people bring in their characters from other campaigns, and this guy showed me his character he had been playing. When I looked at it, I was like, Oriental Adventures? WTF. He was jonesing to play this weird Christopher Lambert clone in our Musketeer-style game. The information was much the same as a standard D&D sheet, and there were things on it that I was unfamiliar with, not owning a copy of the OA rulebook, but there wasn't anything on it that I couldn't work around. He had the usual buffed out character with a noble background, which was par for the course. What really caught my eye were his character's description and his special martial arts attack. The character was 6'2", 280 pounds, from the waist up, her dressed like a Scottish lard, which fit in quite nicely as there was a region near the city that was similar to Scotland. But from the waist down, he was dressed like a samurai with a colorful hakama, quite an exquisite daisho with tabi and clogs. So he basically looked like a man wearing a skirt and slippers to the people of the city, as 99% of them never have been more than a day's travel from their homes. Looks aside, he had an attack that was an OP version of Flurry of Blows that was 10 strikes as a single attack, once an encounter. I took one look at this madness and said, "See you Saturday." I had to see how he played this character. Sorry to interrupt, but if I may speak, while I am not familiar with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons too well, and I wasn't even really a thing in the 90s, I was still a toaster initially, this doesn't sound like a good idea to me. It's a bit of a red flag on OP's side. I can understand being curious, but if you are aware of it being an OP ability, why would you allow that in your game? Stuff like that seems to be a bit of a red flag, since having busted abilities like that can cause problems. Throw in the fact you did not have an official rulebook, and that is something that I have to raise a brow at. And I don't even have eyebrows. To me, a DM should identify issues like this before the campaign begins and work with the player. At the very least, this should have been nerfed to an appropriate level. Even then, I do have an issue with OP's lack of explanation about Highlander's choice in clothing. Yes, I understand it was a more Japanese down below the waist, but OP brought up Scotland. Do you know what is associated with Scottish folk? Kilts.
You're just a big baby! Why did you go cry to your mama?
While not as long as traditional Japanese hakama, what would stop people who are familiar with Scottish-like clothing assume that it was longer kilts? So this was a weird thing to bring up. And even then, I would also argue that it is Scotland-like. There was nothing to prevent the DM from incorporating this kind of fashion statement into his world. It is fiction. If he did not, then that is fine, but considering that he said Scotland, I have to, again, question the OP. Back to the story. So we all meet and I go over some important history. The new characters need to understand how the city politics worked, as the campaign was heavy on intrigue. Highlander immediately tries to derail the campaign by asking, "Can we play in Japan?" I informed him that there was no place called Japan in this world, and the closest thing was a region called Cathay. So he asked me if we could play there, to which I said, "If you can find a way there, sure." I have no problem with players yanking the story elsewhere, but they have to find a legit purpose for the change. I'll admit I did start to consider what he would need to do to get the players on the opposite side of the globe, but he was going to have to earn it. So Highlander saunters into the city to rendezvous with the other characters, and he's moving along with no real problems, as the occasional odd look when I roll a random encounter with a street gang. It's just a handful of kids that start taunting Highlander, and just being nasty to distract him while his pocket gets picked. His reaction to this is to turn on his heel in a prissy manner and tell the teen boys to respect their elders, and then turn his back on them and proceed to walk away. I run my campaigns with the rule actions have consequences, so the lead punk kicks him in the back. Note, doing 1 HP of non-lethal damage. Highlander turns around and, like a good anime character, calls out that he's doing his flurry of blows attack with his fists. I asked him if he was sure he wanted to do that, and he insisted he did. So I told him to roll his attack, and without looking at the NPC stats, I announced he'd hit because whatever his roll was, there was no way he could miss without rolling this one. He proceeded to roll 10d4 of damage. He dropped that fist die and announced, "That's 3 points of damage." "He's dead, Jim," I said. "Keep rolling." "What? He can't be dead." "He is. And keep rolling." I am going to interrupt the story again for 2 reasons. The first is because OP decides to describe Highlander brutally beating up an NPC kid. It's not the most gruesome thing that I have read, but for the sake of being on YouTube and being safe with it, I will skip this next paragraph. But the second reason I feel that this is a bit too much to do. I can understand wanting to have consequences for your players. That's something that every DM should do. But considering to go so far as to turn something like this into a gory murder of a kid for what was initially a non-lethal encounter, which, if I am reading this correctly as well, was the first session with Highlander, comes off as really off-putting to me. Highlander is not in the right here, however. When asked, "Are you sure?" that is a sign that it's a bad idea to continue what you are doing. But to me, this comes off due to inexperience rather than actual problem players. And as the DM, OP has the ability to choose how this happens. And I have to ask, was there any actual conversation with Highlander on how this game was going to go? This is something that OP does not bring up, and this could be an issue of communication or lack of it. To reiterate, I feel both OP and Highlander are in the wrong in this situation. Highlander should have stated that he was going to attack non-lethally and not use his broken homebrew. OP, as the DM, should have asked that, and at the same time at least gone easy on Highlander since it was the first session that he was with the party. Highlander protested that he thought that he had more hit points than the 2 he had. I didn't keep track of the damage he rolled, but I told him he sure as hell didn't have 40 HP. That's when I informed him that a voice behind him was asking if he would please accompany them. It turns out that he was in front of the city watch, and a dozen constables saw the whole thing. He was interrogated and held for about an hour game time before being released of his own recognizance. It was technically self-defense, so he was never in any danger of being imprisoned, but he was now on the radar of every cop, good or crooked, in the city. Over the next few months, Highlander proved to be a pretty ineffectual character. He was a pompous one-trick pony with no interest in the story who could drift away from the party to go to taverns, hoping and asking the staff how to get to Cathay, which none of them could answer because they'd never heard of it or only knew stories. Never once did he go to a school or look for a ship's captain where he could find leads that could take him there. I was really disappointed with Highlander because I'd borrowed a copy of the OA and had started planning the trip they would have to take and the mess they would be in when an imposter turned up in their lands claiming to be a lord with no papers to prove it. Also, I was miffed to find that his flurry of blows was nowhere in the book and was some poorly crafted martial arts created for the character. Still, I decided to throw Highlander a bone since the story was coming to an end and the rest of the group was busy quelling the gang war they had accidentally started. I meant it when I said there are consequences to actions, but that was actually a cool story, so I won't go into it here. If I am going to be honest in here, I don't see this being more on Highlander being a problem, but more on OP's choices. And not only has Highlander been turned into a kid murderer, but is now being watched by all the cops in the city. Something like that seems way too harsh for a first session, especially with a player who just joined up with your group. Next, if Highlander was an issue and didn't have an interest in your story, did you ever talk to him about his lack of interest in it? If that was a problem, why did you as the DM allow him to do that? And as for his search, if none of the staff knew the information or knew rumors about Cathay, why wouldn't they point him in those who would know? You are the DM. You are the god of this world. You said you'd throw him a bone, but it really sounds more like you are working against him without actually talking to Highlander. Going to taverns is one of the oldest tricks in the book to get information about this sort of thing, or at the very least, a start to find where it is. You say he never once looked for a ship's captain, but it wasn't until the next paragraph after I get back from this that apparently this setting was on an island. Why wasn't that information given to Highlander? I do not want to be antagonistic to OP, especially for our first video, but this really seems like a communication with the player would have solved these issues ahead of time. By the way, I do not appreciate that this is really poorly written. So many grammar mistakes. It is making me trip on my vocals. By chance, during one of Highlander's tavern crawls, he happened on an old sailor who told Highlander there was a captain in town that traveled to the east. It was actually to the mainland since they were on an island, but Highlander never asked about that. The clue would lead him to someone who needed work done that would draw them closer to the east. He proceeded to the tavern that was down the alley in the seediest part of the local docks. I don't think he knew anywhere else to get information, so I obliged him. When Highlander entered, I gave a description of the people in the room, and instead of taking the hint to approach the obvious sailor sitting in the back of the common room, he went to a table where a man in once fine but now shabby clothes was sitting and asked if he could take a seat. I honestly didn't think he heard the word shabby. He proceeded to ask his rote question to the high-ranking member of the Thieves Guild. Do you know how to get to Cathay? The NPC stated that information costs, and Highlander passes the guy 1 silver piece. The NPC scoops up the silver and gives Highlander the same answer he got from everyone else who vaguely knew what he was talking about. By boat. Highlander asked if he could give more information, to which the NPC said he could if he could pay. Highlander went to a spiel about that being all the money he had and saved for months to get that silver piece. Here's where I was done with Highlander's lazy antics. His clothes were worth more than any of these men made in a year. His swords would have bought the building, and he was feigning poverty. The NPC would have pointed out the captain if he had been offered a gold piece, 2 after getting the silver to make up for the insult. Instead, he got up and left the building. Telling Highlander to come back when he had money. Highlander did not confirm that this was not his contact or attempt to talk with anyone else. Dejected that he wasted his time, Highlander walked out of the tavern into the darkened alley where he was promptly ambushed by the Thieves Guild member who was lying in wait with his gang. Highlander was beaten unconscious, robbed of his valuables except his swords. I'm not a dick, I figured they would be too hard to fence, and his man's servant was killed. Oh, did I forget to mention he had a retainer that waited on him hand and foot that Highlander would only remember when he didn't want to do something himself? Highlander was pissed after this and proceeded to take out his frustrations on the other party members who refused to pay for his meals and lodging now that he was penniless. It all came to a head when he challenged one of the duelists in the group to a, wait for it, duel.
It's time to duel!
They both were done with each other, so I condoned it. Highlander was out no matter what after this, and I figured the duelist could do with letting off some steam, so I also would retcon the whole thing if it didn't go well for the duelist, though I knew it wouldn't. I'm going to be honest here, I really do not appreciate OP here, or at the very least how the story is being told. Let us say that Highlander truly was a bad player, and by bad, I don't mean he made mistakes that were genuine, because if what OP is saying is true, then Highlander should have been trying other things. But we really don't learn of stuff that Highlander's interactions with the party. Did he not interact with them? Did he do stuff that they hated? Was he lazy in combat? Did he cause trouble for the party? These are questions that I have to ask because OP isn't actually providing them, since it seems like Highlander was being stubborn about going to a certain place, but wasn't causing problems for the party. And why exactly did Highlander want to challenge a duelist to a duel? Also, I do have to talk about conditioning. Even though you brought up the obvious sailor in the room, there was no way for Highlander to know to talk to him. By OP's own words, by chance, during one of Highlander's tavern crawls, he happened on an old sailor who told Highlander there was a captain in town that traveled to the east. It was actually to the mainland since they were on an island, but Highlander never asked about that. The clue would lead him to someone that needed work done that would draw them closer to the east. Why would Highlander go to a sailor when he didn't even know he needed a sailor? Perhaps I'm reading this wrong, but it came off to me that there should have been more out-of-character conversation going on, since why would he know to ask the sailor? That's not even getting into, I'm not a dick, but I'm going to take everything from him and kill his manservant in the process. Like, isn't that a dickish thing to do? And why exactly were Highlander and the duelist fed up with each other? Was there something going on you're not telling us, OP? Was there some beef in the party? If there was, it'd be helpful to have that information. Highlander got in some good rolls and had the duelist on the ropes with about 7 HP left when he decided to play his one ace in the hole. OP flurry of blows. Highlander rolled his attack and hit with his katana. Then he proceeded to roll 10d10, quite pleased with his victory. Now here's where the duelist turned to me to clarify if his duelist special abilities applied. I had been waiting for this moment and replied that it most especially did. I now give you one of the most broken abilities in AD&D. Duelist special abilities, parrying the death blow. Basically, any single weapon attack that can reduce a duelist to 0 hit points can be parried for no damage on a strength save, and duelists were freakishly strong as class back then. So, before Highlander could finish rolling damage, I announced that all of his strikes had been parried. Highlander lost his
Why?
arguing that there was no way a duelist could parry 10 attacks. I had to remind Highlander that it was a single attack of 10 strikes on a single target, therefore the duelist could parry the 10 strikes of this single attack. It was canon, not homebrew, and he would have known this if he'd been paying attention. And from that point on, it was just a slow fight of attrition, as the duelist was eventually reduced to 4 HP and could apply PTDB on Highlander's every weapon attack, while Highlander was whittled down to 0 HP. His beloved samurai, cut down by a lowly peasant with a vulgar piece of metal, was too much for Highlander, who grabbed his things and left the table, never to be heard from again. The campaign continued the unexpected finale, where the son of the Assassin's Guild leader kills the daughter of the Thieves Guild leader, whom he had married to end the gang war, using her as a sacrifice to open the stairway to the heavens to sit on God's head throne and attain godhood. He was thwarted when the Soul Lizard Man, who was immune to its effects, removed the cursed artifacts vital to the spell, collapsing the portal, trapping the assassin between worlds. This was the cursed relic sought by the original big bad evil guy who died in the gang war that was never supposed to happen. I love a good derail, but alas, we never did make it to Japan. I mean, Cathay. End of story. So first off, lizard folk are common, but a guy in a skirt? That's too much! I'm going to be honest here. While I can see Highlander being a bit of a problem, I can't really agree with OP's points on this. A lot of this seems like there's stuff missing that made Highlander into a problem player. Yes, Highlander shouldn't have gone off on his own so much, and from what I'm understanding from the little information we have concerning the other players in the game, we don't have what interactions Highlander had with. And with the exception of Duelist, we don't even have anything go off on why they were mad on each other. Who knows, maybe Highlander was that guy of a character. Totally possible here. But OP certainly doesn't make it easy to believe that. If anything, it seemed like OP was leading Highlander quite a bit and took things a bit too far at times. If you want me to believe that Highlander was a problem player, then you need to provide me with more than just this to make me think that. Include some interactions he had with the party or stuff like that that prove your point. This is also a tale of choice. As a DM, you certainly should have allowed your players choice. You want to avoid railroading, but at the same time, you have to direct your players as well. A possible solution to this would be to include an NPC who had information about Cathay that could be related to the stuff that the main party was in. There, you now have his attention, and can get Highlander back into the main story. Oh well, with the story in the databanks, we'll wrap this up. I hope you all enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider showing your support by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment. I'm Sweeps, and please, have a lovely day.